Welcome to this new episode of Logos. This is the first episode of a new series of um, podcasts within Logos that are in relation with the historical constitution. Historical constitution, Hume, Burke, and Jovellanos. So the first episode of this series of podcasts is going to be on what is the historical constitution. Then I'm going to talk about not only what is, but also how Burke and Jovellanos developed this idea of historical constitution, and finally, the historical development in the history mainly of England and Spain on the historical constitution, how this historical constitution has been evolving in the different political traditions. First of all, I would like to throw a question that is, what makes legitimate a political regime? What makes um, plausible the existence of a political community? Because to some extent we may say, well, in the end it's about the consent of the governed. It's about the social contract. We accepted this social contract. We voted for our representatives, and that's how we are here, right? That's how we have these laws. That's why I'm going to obey this law, because this law, I voted for that law. But what about the idea of nation? What about the idea of um, uh, if we think about France, what's France? France is something that is not, nobody has voted for the idea of France or the idea of England or the idea of Spain. So to some extent, we see there some glimpses of something that we don't know how to express and how to define, and that's to some extent the idea of the ancient constitution. The ancient constitution or the historical constitution. The ancient constitution is that inherited group of mores, languages, ideas that we received. We don't know how exactly. Maybe there are some expectations in that ancient constitution. For example, if we think about how maybe the idea of England for the Normans was very different that in comparison with the idea of England that we have today. However, it's also true that there are some shared concepts and ideas that we inherited, that we are receiving from our ancestors, right? Other generations. And is this common background in which we live, the different political customs that we have, the laws, the way we call some institutions that we have inherited? And this is not a written text. The historical constitution is not a written text, because we cannot write down all the historical process, all the combination of positive and negative events that have happened, tragedies and comedies within the history of a nation or a people, right? So, what gives authority to the authorities? What gives legitimization to the laws? Why do we obey the laws? And why do we have this flag, this other flag, this tradition, this national day? Um, what is the history of my nation, my political community? Is talking about who am I, or how is this political community being constructed, and to what this political community is answering. Because to some extent, many political communities have been the result of wars, for example, or the result of civil wars or religious wars. In the case of France, if we think about France in the 1500s, we see there civil wars, and that's why Jean Baudin arrived with the idea of sovereignty. So now I'm going to explain David Hume, Edmund Burke, and Jovellanos, the three of them, how they talk about this idea of the historical constitution or the ancient constitution. So in the case of David Hume is a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and he talks about the iterative interactions. We have iterative interactions, iterated interactions. Iterated interactions, I do this, and then in this way, and I realize that it's a good way of solving this problem, so then I'm going to explain to my neighbor, and in that way, the tradition is constructed. So David Hume talks about this idea of iterated interaction that could be confronted with John Locke's idea of consent of the governed. So to some extent, why do we have a constitution? Because it is an iterated interaction. It's something that has worked for some years. Or John Locke would say, well, no, we have a constitution because we decided to have a constitution. We have created a compact, right? What's the answer? So these are different perspectives on the same idea, that is the constitution, right? But David Hume may have this original idea that afterwards Edmund Burke is going to enrich, of the ancient constitution. That is the iterated interaction. And Adrian Vermeil, Harvard professor, law professor, talks about the second best constitutionalism. And David Hume can be labeled as this type of second best constitutionalism. Second best meaning that is trying to get out of the reality of things the political compact, and not vice versa. We are not creating a perfect theoretical idea of political community and then we're applying that to the human beings. That would be Lockean, or to some extent Lockean perspective, a theoretical approach of the political community. We have a written constitution, we have perfect written institutions, then we're going to apply them in reality. The second best constitutionalism could be, well, let's look for the second best solution to problems, right? This could be merged, the iterated interaction, the second best constitutionalism, in this idea that David Hume is establishing as the basis, as the foundation for the ancient constitution. And this is an idea that also is very, very important in the Enlightenment, right? When we see the relationship between practice and theory. Practice has a preeminent role in the Enlightenment. It's crucial for the Enlightenment, the practice. And the theory, well, yeah, we already have the theory. That's, to some extent, we are going to talk about later, but the critique of metaphysics, it's in the end a critique of overly theoretical arguments for problems that we can arrive in reality. So this is Hume, this is the iterated interaction. Let's go in the second place with Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, as we all know, he has his magna opus, that is Reflections in the Revolution in France. These reflections on the revolution in France were published in 1790, 1 year after the 1789 French Revolution. And they are answering also to a political discussion within England, mainly with William Pitt, that was the prime minister at the moment, that was not a Whig, it was a Tory. And to some extent, Edmund Burke, who was a Whig, was in the opposition. And also, he realized that the French Revolution had an international aspect and factor that was going beyond the frontiers of France. was the destruction of a political regime that until then, was working, right? So what is Edmund Burke proposing in this in this document? So whenever he talks about the ancient constitution, he's referring to the to three steps, right? Three specific steps. That is, in the first place, the principle of transmission. In the second place, the principle of conservation, and then in the third place, the principle of reformation. And this mixture, of this combination, this mix of these three ideas, these three actions, is really rich. It's a rich idea, because we see in the first place transmission. So how one idea, one political concept, one political regime tries to be transmitted from one generation to the next one. In the second place, conservation. So the idea of, well, then the generation that is receiving the political regime, or this political idea, wants to conserve it, right? Because it has inherited that idea from the previous generation. And finally, reformation. To some extent, there's always a need of flexibility, of adaptability, right? And he also gives a marvelous example, that is the castle, right? A family inherited a castle, and that castle that has been inherited, it's something that is part of the past, right? But also is part of the present, because it's now the property of this family. But also we want to give this castle to the next generation. That's why we see that Edmund Burke is talking about an intergenerational conversation between the dead, the living, and the ones that are going to be born. So these three generations are combined, are in an ongoing conversation in the historical constitution, in the ancient constitution, that is listening to the dead, that is also trying to adapt to the living, and looking forward, the ones that are going to come. This intergenerational conversation, I believe, it's one of the most important ideas that Edmund Burke has to give to political theory and political thinking. Also, when we think about the alternative, that would be revolution, right? And that was what was happening in France in 1789, 1 year before Burke wrote his reflections. And that's why it's really compelling how Edmund Burke is giving not only a critical view on the French Revolution of 1789, but also thinking ahead and establishing this idea that David Hume was talking about, the iterated interaction, that is not only about our will, as John Locke may say, but it's also about the will of the people who came before us, the will of the people that are going to come. I would like also to contrast this idea of Edmund Burke with maybe the idea of the American founders. Edmund Burke was talking about the will of the living, the will of the dead, and the will of the people who are going to come. And then we see how the American founders were talking about, no, this is for the living, right? This is, no, the land belongs to the living, or this nation belongs to the living. This constitution is for the living. It's a constitution for the living. And to some extent, that's a question that we also make. Why do I have to obey these laws that I haven't voted for, or this constitution? And we see the contrast, right? One would be a more everlasting constitution, or something that maybe is not written, but it's in the environment, right? It's in the language, in the morals, in the culture, in the art. And the other one that is also helpful, right? The written constitution, it's helpful, but it's only focusing on the present. And finally, in the third place, I would like to talk about Jovellanos. Why Jovellanos? Why a Spanish political thinker that was contemporary with Edmund Burke but was not contemporary with Hume? Why here? Why put him in conversation with these two other thinkers? Mainly because he came up also with the idea of the historical constitution in a context of political crisis. Spain was invaded by the Napoleonic troops. He and other crafters of the 1812 Spanish constitution were there in Cadiz, and he wrote in 1811 some memories. It's a memorandum, that's his most important political work, explaining what he did in this. Well, he was part of a temporary government when the King of Spain had to flee because of the French invasion. And in that text, he talks and he's trying to answer to a question that everybody was asking him in that moment. Everybody was saying, well, Spain doesn't have a constitution. Spain doesn't have a written constitution, because if you compare the 1789, well, the constitution in France was later, right? But the French model of having a written constitution with maybe the Spanish or the British model that they didn't have written constitutions, you say we don't have a constitution. That was the big question. And he answers, of course we have a constitution. We have the ancient constitution. We have the historical constitution. That is the constitution of the gods, the constitution of the Catholic kings, the constitution, in fact, and of the constitution that are the fundamental laws of the kingdom. And those fundamental laws of the kingdom were transmitting what? Were transmitting the iterated interaction that David Hume was talking about. This second best constitutionalism, this idea of the inherited will of the death, who we are, is what our grandparents gave us. And finally, the idea of how these three thinkers are in a common conversation, and they are talking about the historical constitution. That is something that is an intergenerational conversation, but this doesn't mean that we are diverting or we are not taking into account all the other constitution or the other ideas from other different places, right? So, and that's why it's a really interesting idea to say, well, the historical constitution is something maybe of the past, but at the same time is giving us a lesson of these political ideas that we have. We need to apply them in a very specific moment and space in our own communities that are different from other communities, right? And we can see also a glimpse of an idea that is how we have a duty with our own political community, a duty with our own territory, a duty with the territory maybe that we have adopted as our own territory, but without saying that all the ideas coming from other different traditions, political traditions, are not valid. In fact, what we can see here, Jovellanos was receiving ideas from England through Lord Holland, sorry, and a member of parliament that was explaining to Jovellanos how the British model was working. And the same was true for Burke, that was reading Montesquieu, a French political thinker. So we see there an interaction between different political traditions. But also we can acknowledge that these political ideas are part of a very specific community. So they are not, to some extent, something, well, we can find moral principles that are applicable to different contexts and different times, but at the same time, these principles and these ideas should be also rooted, right? Rooted in a very specific uh, circumstance. And that's why the idea of the historical constitution, it's powerful for our days. Because why do we obey these laws? Why do we have this constitution? Well, this is part of this intergenerational dialogue. This is part of maybe something that we cannot understand perfectly. We cannot say, well, I know it and I know why it's in that way, but we say, well, this is something that I inherited. There may be some efficiency, some utility, and also, and most importantly, is something that we inherited, and that's an argument per se. So thank you very much for listening to this episode of Logos, and I would like also to thank the Institute for Humane Studies and the Department of Politics and International Studies of the University of Cambridge. Here we are in the Cam River, and thank you for making this possible. See you in the next episode.